Although there is overwhelming evidence that the New Testament is an accurate and trustworthy historical document, many people are still reluctant to believe what it says, unless there is also some independent, non-biblical testimony that corroborates its statements.
Have you ever wondered if there is any evidence of Jesus Christ's existence outside the Bible? This intriguing question has been a subject of debate for centuries. Let's delve into the historical evidence, moving from the earliest to the latest, to shed light on this matter. The evidence of Jesus Christ's existence outside the Bible comes from various sources, including Roman and Jewish historians, a satirical writer, rabbinic text, and, potentially, archaeological findings. While none of these conclusively prove Jesus' existence, they collectively form a compelling body of evidence that supports the historical reality of a man named Jesus during the 1st century AD. The debate continues, but these pieces of evidence provide intriguing insight into the mystery of the historical Jesus.
Evidence from the Babylonian Talmud. There are only a few clear references to Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud, a collection of Jewish rabbinical writings compiled between approximately AD 70 to 500. Given this time frame, it is naturally supposed that earlier references to Jesus are more likely to be historically reliable than later ones. In the case of the Talmud, the earliest period of compilation occurred between AD 70 to 200. The most significant reference to Jesus from this period states, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy.'" Let's examine this passage. You may have noticed that it refers to someone named Yeshu. So why do we think this is Jesus? Actually, Yeshu, or Yeshua, is how Jesus' name is pronounced in Hebrew. But what does the passage mean by saying that Jesus was hanged? Doesn't the New Testament say he was crucified? Indeed it does, but the term hanged can function as a synonym for crucified. For instance, Galatians 3:13 declares that Christ was hanged, and Luke 23:39 applies this term to the criminals who were crucified with Jesus. So the Talmud declares that Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover. But what of the cry of the herald that Jesus was to be stoned? This may simply indicate what the Jewish leaders were planning to do. If so, Roman involvement changed their plans. The passage also tells us why Jesus was crucified. It claims he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Since this accusation comes from a rather hostile source, we should not be too surprised if Jesus is described somewhat differently than in the New Testament. But if we make allowances for this, what might such charges imply about Jesus? Interestingly, both accusations have close parallels in the canonical Gospels. For instance, the charge of sorcery is similar to the Pharisees' accusation that Jesus cast out demons by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. But notice this. Such a charge actually tends to confirm the New Testament claim that Jesus performed miraculous feats. Apparently, Jesus' miracles were too well attested to deny. The only alternative was to ascribe them to sorcery. Likewise, the charge of enticing Israel to apostasy parallels Luke's account of the Jewish leaders who accused Jesus of misleading the nation with his teaching. Such a charge tends to corroborate the New Testament record of Jesus' powerful teaching ministry. Thus, if read carefully, this passage from the Talmud confirms much of our knowledge about Jesus from the New Testament.
Phlegon, a secular historian who lived in the 2nd century, made reference to Christ in his works. He mentioned an eclipse and great earthquakes that occurred during Jesus' crucifixion. However, it is important to note that Phlegon's claim of a solar eclipse during a full moon is scientifically impossible. It is also worth mentioning that Julius Africanus stated that Christ died at the end of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. Additionally, there was a great earthquake during Christ's death, as recorded in a historical account of Tiberius. These statements reveal that Christ was crucified and that significant events took place during his death.
Thallus detailed events in ancient history around 52 AD. Early Christians highly valued his work because it discussed Jesus' existence and verified events in the Gospels. For instance, Thales describes the darkness at the time of Jesus' death as a solar eclipse. Unfortunately, the works of Thales have primarily been lost over time and are only found through quotes by other ancient historians like Julius Africanus. In evaluating Thales's claim about a solar eclipse at the time of Jesus' death, Julius Africanus verified events surrounding Jesus' death, even though he disputed Thales's characterization of them. Africanus stated, "This event followed each of his deeds, and healings of body and soul, and knowledge of hidden things, and his resurrection from the dead, all sufficiently proven to the disciples before us and to his apostles. After the most dreadful darkness fell over the whole world, the rocks were torn apart by an earthquake, and much of Judea and the rest of the land was torn down." Thales calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun in the third book of his histories, without reason, it seems to me, for how are we to believe that an eclipse happened when the moon was diametrically opposite the sun? Given this independent verification by another ancient historian who lived at the same time as Thales, Thales's statements about Jesus and his death remain credible, confirming that Jesus was a real person who lived and died where the Bible says he did.
Who was Celsus? Celsus was a Greek philosopher of the 2nd century CE, remembered for his polemics and critiques of the Christian religion and its founder, Jesus Christ. Although his works, which he wrote between the years 175 and 180, have been lost to history, we are fortunate to have him quoted carefully and extensively in the writings of the 3rd century theologian Origen of Alexandria. Origen attempted to answer Celsus's charges in his work against Celsus. It seems that Celsus derived his knowledge of the Christian religion from talking to Christians and from reading some of their materials, such as the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and perhaps a letter of the Apostle Paul. Celsus likely knew the story of Christ's death and resurrection from Matthew's Gospel. As a Neoplatonic philosopher, Celsus believed God, the Logos, to be ineffable and the source of all things. The human soul is also divine in origin, but imprisoned in the body because of some primordial sin. Critique of Christianity. Scholars Tom Holman and Stanley E. Porter explain that sometime around 175 CE, the Neoplatonist thinker Celsus wrote a comprehensive attack on Christianity entitled True Doctrine. This work perished, but not before a large amount, variously estimated at between 60 and 90%, was incorporated into Origen's vigorous response against Celsus about 250 CE. 1. Important to note is that given the lengthy period of 70 or so years between Celsus's writing of the True Doctrine and Origen's rebuttal, it seems that True Doctrine must have had a significant impact on Christianity. Around the year 240 CE, a copy of Celsus's work found its way to Origen, who was requested to write a refutation of it. Celsus's criticisms attempted to discredit Christ's conception, birth, childhood, ministry, death, resurrection, and continuing influence. 2. He also appealed to Christians to adopt paganism instead of Christianity.
Celsus rejected the doctrine of Christ's divinity, stating that Christ did not fulfill the messianic expectations and could not convince his fellow countrymen of his divine mission. He argued that Christ's miracles were nothing more than sorcery, and that his prediction of his own death and resurrection were inventions of his disciples. Celsus ridiculed Christians for their blind faith and lack of reason. He also posed the challenge of the compatibility of a good and just God with the existence of evil, questioning how God could create evil, and threatened to destroy his own offspring.
Christ, alleges Celsus, claimed to have been born of virgin birth. He calls this a fabrication, and alleges Christ to have invented his birth from a virgin. Let us imagine what a Jew, let alone a philosopher, might say to Jesus, "Is it not true, good sir, that you fabricated the story of your birth from a virgin to quiet rumors about the true and unsavory circumstances of your origins? Is it not the case that far from being born in the royal David city of Bethlehem, you were born in a poor country town, and of a woman who earned her living by spinning?" Celsus then proposes his own theory, which is that Christ's mother, a married Jewish woman who made her living from spinning cloth, actually had an affair and committed adultery with a Roman soldier. Christ's mother was turned down by the carpenter who was betrothed to her, as she had been convicted of adultery, and had a child by a certain soldier named Pantera. Pantera was a common name among Roman soldiers of the period, although most commentators think that some Jews used this name because of its similarity to the term parthenos, virgin. Celsus claims that many of the ideas Christians have are expressed better and earlier by the Greeks, who were modest enough to refrain from saying that their ideas came from a god or a son of God. The teachings and doctrines of the Christians were borrowed from the Greeks and then given an inferior reconceptualization, thus leading Celsus to claim that there is nothing new in Christianity's ethical teachings, and that when one compares it to other philosophies, its simple-mindedness becomes apparent. The Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body is borrowed and is little more than the Greek idea of the transmigration of the soul. Celsus invites the Christians to leave their cult and embrace reason in the religion of the majority.
What is the value of Celsus's testimony and the various claims he makes about Christ? As noted already, we do not have Celsus's own words, only quotations from Origen, which means one needs to hold many of the quotations somewhat tentatively. Most scholars do believe, however, that Origen quotes Celsus with a degree of reasonable accuracy. Celsus makes a number of striking claims that are historically disputable. For example, to the best of our knowledge, the historical Jesus did not himself teach that he was born of a virgin, despite this becoming an Orthodox Christian belief. Although Christ might well have taught such a thing at some point during his ministry, we just don't know. One only learns of his unique birth from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written roughly 40 years after his ministry. Further, no credible and early historical sources support Celsus's contention that Christ was conceived due to an affair between his mother and the Roman soldier Pantera. Although very few scholars have ever supported this idea, most would say that Celsus's testimony, along with some other later polemical Jewish sources making the same claim, such as the Talmud, is insufficient to support this idea, especially when compared to earlier sources claiming otherwise. Celsus's value as testimony is limited because of his strong anti-Christian agenda, which suggests him not to have been particularly impartial. He is also much too late to be viewed as a reliable writer on the historical Jesus. In fact, Celsus was writing later than some other very legendary and embellished Christian texts, such as some of the Apocrypha, that few deem historically reliable. Christ's ministry dates to the first half of the 1st century CE, over 150 years before Celsus's time of writing, more or less. According to Van Voorst, Evans, and Chilton, key value of Celsus's comments about the historical Jesus is limited. Because we do not have the exact wording of true doctrine and cannot be sure that Origen has given us the order of Celsus's book, conclusions must be tentative. Nevertheless, Celsus's main attack on Christianity is philosophical, not historical. His more detailed information about Jesus, which by virtue of his knowledge of Christian writings should be fairly accurate, is distorted by his sharp polemic, a part of which is lampooning. Celsus's value does lie in him informing historians of Christian belief, such as belief in the virgin birth of Christ that was already present in the 2nd century. The virgin birth was evidently well known by the time of the 2nd century, and was for some, like Celsus, a belief worthy of ridicule. Further, Celsus provides historians with valuable information on Jewish responses to Christianity, given his extensive use of Jewish polemic that reflect in his criticisms. Van Voorst, Evans, and Chilton conclude, nevertheless, it is evident that Celsus is a rich source for pagan and Jewish polemic against Christianity, and to a lesser degree, its Christ. Indeed, among pagan authors, Celsus is unique in relaying both Jewish and Greco-Roman objections to Christianity. Polemical and tendentious, his treatment of Christ is of little value in our knowledge of the historical Jesus.
Lucian of Samosata, a satirist who lived from AD 120–180, held a scornful view of Christians. In his writings, such as The Passing Peregrinus and Alexander the False Prophet, he made reference to Jesus Christ. According to Lucian, the Christians worshipped a man who introduced a new cult and was crucified as a result. These misguided individuals believed in their own immortality, which led to their disregard for death and their self-devotion. They followed the teachings of their lawgiver, who taught them to consider themselves as brothers and to reject the Greek gods. Instead, they worshipped the crucified sage, Jesus, and lived according to his laws. All of this was based on their faith. In conclusion, Lucian of Samosata's writings reveal that Christians worshipped Jesus, believed in his teachings, and lived by faith.
Mara bar Serapion, a philosopher during the 1st century, is known for a letter that he wrote to his son about Jesus. Scholars believe that the letter was written sometime between 73 AD and the 3rd century. Mara was not a Christian, but he spoke highly of Jesus, the King, and Christianity. One passage from the letter states, "What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 men, the Jew, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera, nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given." From this quote, Jesus was identified as King of the Jews. Jesus was known as a good and wise man. Mara, a non-believer, even stated that Jesus was wrongly executed, but that there were consequences for this act. This commentary aligns directly with the Bible. Mara also wrote that Jesus did not die, but he lived on through his teachings.
The challenges to Mara as a source for the historical Jesus are 2. First, and much less seriously, there is the fact Mara does not name Jesus. The attempt to deny that the reference to wise king means Jesus is very flimsy. From a non-Christian perspective, this is exactly how one would expect Jesus to be referred to, since he had been executed by the Romans as a royal pretender. The reference to the new laws is also a telling allusion to Christianity, especially in this period. St. Paul's mission to the Gentiles had been bitterly contested within the early Jesus sect by the other leaders, including by Jesus' brother, James. Whether the Gospel of Mark was written in the conventional dating period, c. 65 to 70 AD, or c. 40 AD, as some have argued, it would have been completed by the time Mara wrote his letter. It is possible that the Gospel of Matthew had been written. G. Matthew is usually dated to c. 70-80 AD, but if the earlier date of G. Mark is correct, then perhaps G. Matthew dates from nearer 60 AD. Mark's Gospel is very distinctly Jewish in its frame of reference, and G. Matthew's whole premise is to stress Jesus as the Savior of the Jews and their rejection of him. It is in G. Matthew 5:17 that Jesus is quoted saying, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." What both of the first 2 synoptic Gospels bear witness to is that the Jesus sect in the late 1st century is still not clearly distinct even within itself from Iudaismos, and, for an outsider like Mara looking in, the distinction between ideologically divergent groups of Jews would have been essentially impossible to perceive. The key thing most pagans knew about Judean distinctiveness was their law, halakha, which in fundamental ways remained in place within the Jesus sect, even if some of the practices this led to, like circumcision, not an easy thing for an outsider to detect, were beginning to be set aside. The potential reasons for not naming Jesus directly are numerous. An obvious possibility is Mara trying not to offend the Romans by drawing attention to their responsibility for killing Jesus. The letter is very firm in framing Jesus' death as something the Jews did. Since the Romans are ruling over Mara's people and have taken him captive, his disinclination to provoke them further would be understandable. The other problem for Mara is that he has cast the sack of Jerusalem as punishment from the gods, and that was carried out by the Romans. Too explicitly classifying the Romans as instruments of divine vengeance undercuts his argument that they should not have devastated his homeland. Another possibility is that Mara is trying to ensure that Jesus is not given the same exalted status he awards to Socrates and Pythagoras.
If Mara's letter is from the 70s or 80s AD, it would add a small piece to the pile of evidence for the historical Jesus, though it makes little difference one way or the other. As the late Maurice Casey put it in his final book before his death in 2014, the whole idea that Jesus of Nazareth did not exist as a historical figure is verifiably false, and trying to reason with the atheists who believe in Jesus' mythicism is largely pointless. Belongs in the fantasy lives of people who used to be fundamentalist Christians. They did not believe in critical scholarship then, and they do not do so now. The historical importance of Mara's letter is limited by the fact that we do not know where he got his information from. Mara was not an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, obviously, and it seems likely he found out about Jesus from Christians. That said, especially if this is from c. 73 AD, it is important in showing that the Christians whom Mara was speaking to identified Jesus the man, a figure within their living memory, or the memory of people they knew, as the origin point of their creed, exploding the elaborate mythicist ideas that Jesus is a fabricated back projection, perhaps by Paul. All the same, Mara's letter says more about Christianity than about Christ. Mara's letter, even with the earlier date, is mostly interesting because it is a Stoic writer from an area outside the Roman Empire, Christianity in a positive light. Earliest non-Christian philosophical reference to Christianity that we have show the appeal that Christianity could have for some educated people, and thus shed some light on how it was that this tiny persecuted sect spread throughout the Roman world.
Pliny the Younger provides valuable historical information about Jesus and the early church. As the governor of the Roman province of Bithynia, he wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan in 112 AD, seeking guidance on how to handle Christians in his region who were accused of crimes. In his letter, Pliny describes the practices of these criminals. They would gather on a specific day before dawn and sing hymns to Christ as if he were a god. They would also take a solemn oath to abstain from wicked deeds such as fraud, theft, and adultery. They would separate after their gathering and then come together again to share a meal of ordinary and innocent food. From this passage, we can gather several facts about the early church in Asia Minor. Firstly, Christians met on a specific day, most likely referring to Sunday worship. Secondly, they worshipped Jesus Christ as a deity, providing early evidence of their belief in his divinity. Thirdly, adherence to the teachings of the church on both faith and morality was required.
Pliny the Younger's writings provide one of the first non-biblical texts to address early Christians and Rome's response to them. He confirmed that Christianity was growing rapidly and holding to specific beliefs. Pliny the Younger stated that Christians prayed to Jesus like God. He also wrote, "They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a god, and bound themselves by solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind." Pliny the Younger expressed uncertainty about what to do with these Christians who did not worship Roman gods, but their God alone, thus rejecting Roman rule. As a governor, he asked Emperor Trajan how he should deal with them if they disobeyed Roman authority and religious practices. Pliny the Younger did not actively seek out Christians to persecute them, but if they were presented to him, he would kill them for remaining faithful to their Christian beliefs over Roman rule.
The Roman historian Suetonius mentions early Christians and may refer to Jesus Christ in his work, Lives of the 12 Caesars. One passage in the biography of the Emperor Claudius refers to agitations in the Roman Jewish community and the expulsion of Jews from Rome by Claudius during his reign. In this context, Cresto is mentioned. Some scholars see this as a likely reference to Jesus, while others see it as referring to an otherwise unknown person living in Rome. Christians are explicitly mentioned in Suetonius's biography of the Emperor Nero as among those punished during Nero's reign. These punishments are generally dated to around AD 64, the year of the Great Fire of Rome. In this passage, Suetonius describes Christianity as excessive religiosity, as do his contemporaries, Tacitus and Pliny. Historians debate whether or not the Roman government distinguished between Christians and Jews prior to Nerva's modification of the Fiscus Judaicus in AD 96. From then on, practicing Jews paid the tax, Christians did not.
The Latin original version of this statement is as follows: Judeos impulsore Cresto assidue tumultuantis Roma expulit. The Latin text is ambiguous and can be interpreted in two ways. The first interpretation suggests that Claudius only expelled those Jews who were making disturbances. The second interpretation suggests that Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome because they were constantly causing disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. The term Chrestus was common at the time and could have been a misspelling of Christus. Most scholars believe that Suetonius misheard the name Christus as Chrestus and misunderstood the report, assuming that the followers of someone called Chrestus were causing disturbances within the Jewish community. However, some scholars argue that Chrestus was simply a Jewish agitator with a common name and had no association with Christianity. The precise cause of the expulsion remains unclear.
Most scholars assume that the disturbances mentioned by Suetonius in the passage were due to the spread of Christianity in Rome. These disturbances were likely caused by the objections of Jewish community to the continued preachings by Hellenistic Jews in Rome and their insistence that Jesus was the Messiah, resulting in tensions with the Jews in Rome. Some scholars think Suetonius was confused and assumed that Chrestus, as the leader of the agitators, was alive and lived in Rome at the time of the expulsion. The notion that Chrestus was instigating Jewish unrest suggests that the Chrestus reference is not a Christian interpolation, for a Christian scribe would be unlikely to think of the followers of Christ as Jews, or place him in Rome at the time of Claudius. This problem weakens the historical value of the reference as a whole. Scholars are divided on the value of the Suetonius reference. Some see it as a reference to Jesus, others see it as a reference to disturbances by an unknown agitator. Dating the expulsion provides some challenges because Suetonius writes in a topical rather than chronological fashion, necessitating the use of other texts to establish a time frame. The dating of the Edict of Claudius for the expulsion of Jews relies on three separate texts beyond Suetonius's own reference, which in chronological order are the reference to the trial of Apostle Paul by Gallio in the Acts of the Apostles, Cassius Dio's reference in history, and Paulus Orosius's 5th century mention in History of a non-extant Josephus. Scholars generally agree that these references refer to the same event. Most scholars agree that the expulsion of some Jews mentioned by Suetonius happened around AD 49-50, but a minority of scholars suggest dates within a few years of that range.
In Nero 16, Suetonius lists various laws by Nero to maintain public order, including halting chariot races as the drivers were cheating and robbing, and pantomime shows which frequently were scenes of brawls. Amongst these is punishment for Christians. He states, "During his reign, many abuses were severely punished and put down, and no fewer new laws were made. A limit was set to expenditures. The public banquets were confined to a distribution of food. The sale of any kind of cooked viands in the taverns was forbidden, with the exception of pulse and vegetables, whereas before every sort of dainty was exposed for sale. Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. He put an end to the diversions of the chariot drivers, who from immunity of long standing claimed the right of ranging at large and amusing themselves by cheating and robbing the people. The pantomimic actors and their partisans were banished from the city. Apart from the manuscripts and printed editions of Suetonius' Lives, the sentence about Christians is first attested in an inscription by the Senate and people of Paris from 1590. K.R. Bradley notes that the verb in the clause, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, Latin afflicti supplicius Christianae, should be corrected to affecti. Based first on the frequent use of this verb with the word for punishment, and second on that Orosius, according to Bradley, uses this verb in material dependent on the Suetonius Nero 16 passage. These words in combination indicate that the punishment was capital, cf. e.g. Suet. Augustus 17.5, death of young Antony, Claudius 26.2, death of Messalina, and Galba 12.1, death of officials. In Roman usage, the word superstitio refers to any excessive religious devotion within or outside traditional Roman religious practice. To Suetonius, this particular excessive devotion was new and mischievous. This may have been the case in Suetonius' time, but Marius Heemstra thinks he was backdating the accusation to the time of Nero. The word translated as mischievous above is maleficus, which can also mean magical. As a noun, the word means magician. It may be that Suetonius is here accusing Christians of using what would be called black magic in modern terms,
as the pagan philosopher Celsus did about 177.
Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian born in Jerusalem 4 years after the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. His writings have a near eyewitness quality and provide insight into the cultural background of the New Testament era. Josephus's two greatest works, Jewish Antiquities and Jewish War, cover Hebrew history from the creation to the destruction of Jerusalem. Josephus is the most comprehensive primary source on Jewish history from antiquity. His writings correlate well with the Old and New Testaments and provide additional evidence on figures such as Herod the Great, John the Baptist, and Pontius Pilate. In his writings, Josephus refers to Jesus of Nazareth twice. These references, along with other non-biblical, non-Christian sources, prove the historicity of Jesus. However, these references have been attacked and criticized for centuries. The references to Jesus in Josephus's works are the largest block of first-century evidence for Jesus outside of biblical or Christian sources. They have survived manuscript transmission across the centuries almost intact, unlike many other works from antiquity.
Antiquities, 1863. The standard text of Josephus reads as follows. About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was the achiever of extraordinary deeds, and was a teacher of those who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When he was indicted by the principal men among us and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him originally did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, restored to life, as the prophets of the deity had foretold these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Although this passage is so worded in the Josephus manuscripts as early as the 3rd century church historian Eusebius, scholars have long suspected a Christian interpolation, since Josephus could hardly have believed Jesus to be the Messiah or in his resurrection and have remained, as he did, a non-Christian Jew. In 1972, however, Professor Shlomo Pines of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem announced his discovery of a different manuscript tradition of Josephus's writings in the 10th century Melkite historian Agapius, which reads as follows at Antiquities 1863. At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Here clearly is language that a Jew could have written without conversion to Christianity.
Scholars have differing opinions on Antiquities 1863. Some believe that the original passage is completely authentic, although this is a minority position. On the other hand, there is a much smaller minority who argue that it is entirely a Christian forgery. The majority position today, supported by the Agapian text, is that the passage contains Christian interpolations within Josephus's original, authentic material about Jesus. There are several reasons to believe that Josephus did mention Jesus in the authentic core material at 1863. Firstly, this passage is present in all Greek manuscripts of Josephus. Additionally, the Agapian version aligns well with Josephus's grammar and vocabulary in other parts of his work. It is worth noting that Jesus is described as a wise man, sophos aner, a phrase not commonly used by Christians, but used by Josephus to describe figures like David and Solomon in the Hebrew Bible. Furthermore, Josephus's claim that Jesus won over many of the Greeks is not supported in the New Testament. This suggests that it is not a Christian interpolation, but rather something that Josephus would have noted during his own time. Lastly, the fact that the second reference to Jesus at Antiquities 20:200 simply calls him the Christos, Messiah, without further explanation, implies that a previous, more detailed identification had already been made. If Jesus had been introduced for the first time at this later point in Josephus's record, it is likely that a phrase like brother of a certain Jesus, who was called the Christ, would have been used. In conclusion, the majority view among scholars today is that Antiquities 1863 contains Christian interpolations within Josephus's original material about Jesus.
Now Antiquities 20:200. This is an extremely important passage since it has so many stunning parallels to what took place on Good Friday, and yet it seems to be largely ignored in revisionist New Testament scholarship. It tells of the death of Jesus' half-brother, James the Just of Jerusalem, under the high priest Ananus, son of the former high priest Annas and brother-in-law to Caiaphas, both well known from the Gospels. Josephus's text reads as follows. Having such a character, Ananus thought that with Festus dead and Albinus still on the way, he would have the proper opportunity. Convening the judges of the Sanhedrin, he brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. But those of the city residents who were deemed the most fair-minded and who were strict in observing the law were offended at this. Accordingly, they secretly contacted the king, urging him to order Ananus to desist from any more such actions, for he had not been justified in what he had already done. Some of them even went to meet Albinus, who was on his way from Alexandria, and informed him that Ananus had no authority to convene the Sanhedrin without his consent. Convinced by these words, Albinus wrote in anger to Ananus, threatening him with punishment. And King Agrippa, because of this, deposed him from the high priesthood, in which he had ruled for 3 months. This, Josephus's second reference to Jesus, shows no tampering whatever with the text, and it is present in all Josephus manuscripts. Had there been Christian interpolation here, more material on James and Jesus would doubtless have been presented than this brief passing notice. James would likely have been wreathed in laudatory language and styled the brother of the Lord, as the New Testament defines him, rather than the brother of Jesus. Nor could the New Testament have served as Josephus's source, since it provides no detail on James's death. For Josephus to further define Jesus as the one who was called the Christos was both credible and even necessary in view of the 20 other Jesuses he cites in his works.
Accordingly, the vast majority of contemporary scholars regard this passage as genuine in its entirety, and concur with ranking Josephus expert Louis H. Feldman in his notation in the Loeb Classical Library edition of Josephus. Few have doubted the genuineness of this passage on James. Louis H. Feldman, Tr. Josephus 9, 496. The preponderance of evidence then strongly suggests that Josephus did indeed mention Jesus in both passages. He did so in a manner totally congruent with the New Testament portraits of Christ, and his description, from the vantage point of a non-Christian, seems remarkably fair, especially in view of his well-known proclivity to roast false messiahs as wretches who misled the people and brought on war with the Romans. Furthermore, his second citation regarding the attitudes of the high priest and Sanhedrin versus that of the Roman governor perfectly mirrors the gospel versions of the two opposing sides at the Good Friday event. And this extra-biblical evidence comes not from a Christian source trying to make the Gospels look good, but from a totally Jewish author who never converted to Christianity.
Another notable ancient historian was Cornelius Tacitus. Many consider Tacitus the most important Roman historian of the 1st century. His writings actually lend support to the accuracy of Josephus, which is important from a historical standpoint. Quoting from Annals 15.44, Tacitus writes that Emperor Nero blamed Christians for Rome's fire in 64 AD in order to draw attention away from him. In this account, Jesus is mentioned. But not all the relief that could come from man, not all the bounties that the prince could bestow, nor all the atonements which could be presented to the gods, availed to relieve Nero from the infamy of being believed to have ordered the conflagration, the fire of Rome. Hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with the guilt, and punished Christians who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Tacitus turns out to be an extremely rich source of data that confirms important aspects of the history of Christianity. He was an unsympathetic witness to the success and spread of Christianity. What do we learn from him? He regards Christus, Jesus Christ, as the founder of the movement. This weighs heavily against the idea that some scholars hold that Paul or some other person was the creator of Christianity. Jesus founded Christianity according to Tacitus. He confirms the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. He indicates that Jesus' death suppressed Christianity for a time. This would hint at the probability that Christianity was recognized to have had some status as a movement, not under the name Christianity, prior to the death of Jesus. He indicates that Christians in Rome in the mid-60s AD were hated and punished for their faith. Tacitus unwittingly becomes another valuable non-biblical source for information about Jesus. Again, the information supports and doesn't contradict the biblical accounts.
As with other works of antiquity, historians wish we had more manuscripts. We only have 2 manuscripts for Tacitus, and they only contain half his writings. Unfortunately, the portion of Tacitus's annals dealing with the years 29-31 CE is missing from our manuscripts. We don't know for sure whether he described the life or death of Jesus further in the missing portion of his book. Almost all scholars concur with the opinion of John P. Meyer on Tacitus. The passage is obviously genuine. Not only is it witnessed in all the manuscripts of the annals, the very anti-Christian tone of the text makes Christian origin almost impossible. Christ mythicists raise a problem. In his passage on Jesus, Tacitus referred to Pilate as a procurator, which was not the technical term for Pilate's Judean post. Prefect is the more precise title. Those seeking to deny the historicity of Jesus leap on this anachronism and claim the passage is phony, or Tacitus has not done his homework and is simply parroting Christian belief. Therefore, they say this passage simply leads to arguing in a circle and is not valid attestation to the existence of Jesus. It is true Tacitus using procurator is an anachronism. Prior to Agrippa, who ruled Judea from 41-44 AD, Roman governors held the rank of prefect. Tacitus made use of procurator, though, because it was more common when he wrote instead of prefectus. On the variant of spellings of Christus, see Elsa Gibson, The Christians for Christians, Inscriptions of Phrygia, Greek Texts, Translation and Commentary, Harvard Theological Studies 32. Gibson reproduces and analyzes 45 inscriptions and only 6 have the correct spelling. For example, take note of the errors on this gravestone, Christians for Christians.
Let's summarize what we've learned about Jesus from this examination of ancient non-Christian sources. First, both Josephus and Lucian indicate that Jesus was regarded as wise. Second, Pliny, the Talmud, and Lucian imply he was a powerful and revered teacher. Third, both Josephus and the Talmud indicate he performed miraculous feats. Fourth, Tacitus, Josephus, the Talmud, and Lucian all mention that he was crucified. Tacitus and Josephus say this occurred under Pontius Pilate, and the Talmud declares it happened on the eve of Passover. Fifth, there are possible references to the Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection in both Tacitus and Josephus. Sixth, Josephus records that Jesus' followers believed he was the Christ, or Messiah. And finally, both Pliny and Lucian indicate that Christians worship Jesus as God. I hope you see how this small selection of ancient non-Christian sources helps corroborate our knowledge of Jesus from the Gospels. Of course, there are many ancient Christian sources of information about Jesus as well. But since the historical reliability of the canonical Gospels is so well established, I invite you to read those for an authoritative life of Jesus.